Hi, this is Ann V. Brady, and I will be talking about my book, A New Beginning, the story of my adoption, life, and service by Ann V. Brady, illustrated by Eric C. Brady. Now, what I want to talk about my book is why I wrote the book and certain excerpts from it and what I hope to gain from it. Uh, I make a little bit of money from this book when it's sold. I tried to make it as cheap and inexpensive as possible so that people who don't have much money can buy the book either through Kindle or paperback or hardcover. I have two hardcover versions. One is cheaper and it's $16.50 and it only has black and white pictures because I bought used cheaper paper and it won't take the color pictures. The more expensive book, hardcover book, is $31 and it has both black and white and color pictures in it. Excuse me. But anyway, the way I read my book is I started with my adoption. And now the first chapter is about my adoption. I don't remember much of it. I remember living with my family. I do start it off with where and when I was born. And then I go directly into my life with my family. It's a short chapter, and that's because at the time I moved. And each chapter is a different phase of my life. Okay. I went to chapter 2 when we moved to New York. And then I also included in there my kindergarten and grade school. And then high school was a separate chapter. And then college was a separate chapter. And when I entered the military after graduating from college, I divided the chapters into my duty stations: Walter Reed, Beaumont Army Medical Center, uh, going to El Paso, Texas, and William Beaumont Army Medical Center, and then to Hawaii and Triple Army Medical Center, and then to Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center, which no longer exists, in Colorado, and then to school at San Antonio, Texas, Advanced Medical Licensed Technologist School at William can't remember the name of it right now. But anyway, to the school at San Antonio, Texas. And then directly to the next chapter was Fort Rucker, now Fort Novosel, uh, Army Medical Center, Fort. And I worked in medical research all my life. Uh, I've worked in clinical labs and medical research in the military and after I retired. Once I retired, uh, the chapters were when I first retired and when we moved to Prattville and from job to job, so forth. And most of it is about my life. Some of it's interesting. Some people may find some of it boring. I think I had an interesting life. Uh, I do talk about adoption. I don't really talk about adoption until I get to Colorado because that's when I finally decided to search for my birth family. I was looking basically for my birth mother because I was curious. I wanted to know why I was given up. And everybody hears all about birth mothers being young teenagers and being forced to give up their child or wanting to give up their child so they could get a college degree, or because they're too young to raise a child. Uh, Back in the 50s, that was a stigma. You were shuffled off to a well, not a nursing home, but a home for unwed mothers to wait until they had their baby, and the baby was snatched away and shuttled off to even an orphanage or some family that was willing to adopt the child. Uh, so, and then they came back, and of course, no one ever talked about, young Susie going off to Aunt Matilda's in Nebraska, for the whole summer, you know, because, that was never discussed because no one wanted to know they had a child that had a girl that had a child out of wedlock. That was frowned upon. And it was a stigma. Uh, Fortunately, we moved past that. But when I started searching, I had no clue where to start really. I did ask my adoptive mother, my mom, what she knew, if she knew my birth mother's name, anything about her. She told me she thought it was, you know, McDonald. The last name was McDonald, and or my birth name was McDonald, and I kind of like my name was Ronnie McDonald, you know, because in my family that adopted me, even though my name was changed to Anne, my middle name was Veronica, and they always called me Ronnie, either that or Princess, because I was spoiled. I have to say that. But I was that I could do or be anything I wanted to. And I am thankful for that. And I'm thankful for a family that loved me. And my mother knew someday I would search or might search. And that's what I want to talk about mainly. Like I said, I've had a weird life. Being adopted, I don't know how much that had to do with it. Uh, anyway, I wrote to the city of Tewksbury and their city hall and requested information or a birth certificate, uh, records, and I heard nothing back. And back then we had FidoNet and billboard systems. There wasn't a real internet. Uh, I was into billboards and just playing games on billboards and discussing war and other things on different billboards and just chatting around. And I asked somebody if they knew of an adoptee search billboard. I figured that was the place to ask for advice about that, about how to continue or start the search. And so I found out there was one, and I went into it and joined it. And I explained my situation. And that's where I found out about social services. And so I went to, I looked up on FidoNet about social services in Boston, Massachusetts, and I found a website. And there were forms on that website that allowed me to fill in, or I could request a form. I requested a form, and I told them that I thought my name was Flora McDonald. I gave them my adoptive parents' name, when I was born, where I was born, and with money, mailed it in. Uh, and so one morning about 7 o'clock, the phone rings, and I'm getting ready for work, fixing food for the kids and my husband, myself, breakfast. And there's this woman, Sheila Frankel. And she tells me that my name, what my actual name was Veronica Cecilia Pierce. And she mentions, did you know that you had a brother, Robert? And I'm like thinking, I have a brother, Robert, who's in my adoptive family. I had two brothers, Bob and Jim. And so I'm thinking she's confused that I have a brother, Robert, and she's looking at Bob Newman. And so then she stops and she says, wait a minute. And she looks and says, oh no, you do have a brother, Robert. I had a Robert Newman, which was from the adoptive family, and a Robert Pierce, which was my birth brother. And I was like, wow. Uh, but she said that she could send me a non redacted file and that I needed to, if I wanted my original birth certificate, I had to get a court order. I mean, it's since been changed in Massachusetts on that for certain years. Uh, so I had to request a court order, and she said, send a letter to the probate judge in Middlesex, Massachusetts. And so I did that, and I was allowed to go ahead and get my original birth certificate. Well, when I got my original birth certificate, it only had my mother's name on it, which was Helen Frances Pierce. No birth father's name at all, which left me in a quandary because who's my birth father? But anyway, I got my file, and there was some interesting stuff in there. I noticed that some stuff was redacted, but it was weird because if you looked at it carefully, it was not redacted or whited out consistently. You know, the date of birth or for my birth mother was listed as October 18, 19 blank. And then somewhere else it was October blank 1919. And her name was in places Helen Frances P., also known as Frances as Helen Pierce. And so it was like, well, anyway, I posted on the thing about Helen Pierce and that's who I was looking for, Frances Pierce. And on the internet, I got a message from somebody that had a snippet about a Helen Pierce being born October 8th, 1919, from Somerville, Massachusetts, and said, hope this isn't your mother. And I said, the odds of Helen Frances Pierce being born October 18th, 1919 and October 8th, 1919 in Somerville, Massachusetts, is awfully coincidental. In other words, it turns out, because I eventually was able to get a birth certificate and death certificate for my birth mother, uh, that the social workers got my mother's birth date wrong. It was October 8th, 1919. So, and I found out I did have a brother, Robert Pierce, who was born April 12th, 1950, in Dorchester, Massachusetts. I got part of his file, and he was never adopted. Uh, and I discuss a little bit about that too, because when I finally met him, which wasn't until like 1995 in November on Veterans Day, uh, but we finally met. I was still in the Army at that time. After I was retired, he came to live with us as his wife had died and he'd lost a home. He had never really worked except transition work in California, but he had a horrible childhood. Uh, what was bad was he was put with a family, the last name Stewart, uh, and he lived with them from the time of his birth until he was about 9 or 10 years old. And he didn't know they were a foster family. He thought that his name was Robert Stewart. He thought they were his family. It was an older couple, according to him, and he said that there were other children there too that were with them. And when he was 9 or 10, someone came to talk to him and asked him if he would like to go to a new school. And he thought nothing of it, and he said, "Yeah, okay." And so, with the clothes on his back, they took him, dumped him off in an orphanage run by nuns, and left him there. And so he had no idea. And now he did say that when he lived with the Stewarts, that there was a woman who came to visit him, on several occasions, and he had no idea who she was. He later found out, we realized that was when we discussed it, that probably was our mother, Helen. And you have to realize she was born in 1919. She had Bob in 1950. She had me in 1954. So you're talking, she's about 30 years old when she had my brother, and 34, almost 35 years old when she had me. So you're talking about an older woman. I did find in my file about her, and her life was no piece of cake either. And she took care of her mother, who was dying of cancer and died in 1938 when my birth mother was 19 years old. And she told the social worker she was going back to school. She was going to she kept a promise to her mother that she would graduate from high school. And she did that. And then she went on to Holy Ghost nursing school, where she studied and became an LPN, licensed practical nurse. But she had a brother, John Pierce, and I found him by accident. While I left Colorado and I was going to school in San Antonio, so I didn't have time to search then. But while I was in Colorado, I did contact the Roxbury nursing home and talk to someone about her. And And she said she didn't know her very well, and she told me what she did know. And she offered that there was a nurse there that actually knew her pretty well, and I probably should have taken her up on the offer and given her my telephone number, but I was thinking I didn't want to bother anybody. Well, I should have. But anyway, because I would like to know more about what my mother was like. Uh, Now, I decided to search for my birth brother, and I also did contact the hospital where I was born and asked for medical records for my mother just during the time uh, she was having me and she was at the hospital. And he said he needed a court order for that. And so I contacted the probate judge, and one of her aides said he would do it. And he typed up a letter and he sent me notice that when he did that, he requested that the records be sent to him because that way he could make sure that I got the records because the hospital said, yeah, we'll send her the records and not do anything. And so he did that, and I did get the records, and I found out a little bit about my mother's medical health. And I do know she stayed up in the ward, the sanitary ward of Tewksbury Hospital while she was pregnant with me. Now, I also know that at one time, I know she stayed in an institution, and because the Tewksbury State Hospital institution, and she stayed there, but she also stayed at another institution for the insane. The question is whether she was actually insane or not. A lot of doctors thought she was insane because she wasn't regretful and sorry that she had two children out of wedlock. And so I don't know whether she had sanity problems or if she was a nervous woman because of pressure put on her by the family. I do know that, I searched for my birth brother, Robert. I looked in Massachusetts because Robert Pierce is such a common name. And somebody found a Robert Pierce, and I called them, and I found out that it was my cousin, not my brother. He was born a year after my brother was. Uh, and through him, I found my uncle. We both had an interest in genealogy. And my uncle told me he was starting to get dementia. But we talked, and I sent him copies of my mother's birth and death certificate and a copy of my birth certificate to prove who I am. But what was weird was when I talked to my cousin Robert, he said, "Oh," I told him who I was and was wondering if he was my brother. He said, "No, I'm your cousin." He said, "We've heard about you." And I was like, "Wow," you know. But my uncle John, was said that my mother had an acerbic personality. He did say that, well, it was also in the file that my birth mother resented Aunt Agnes Cooper, who was my grandmother's sister, for showing up after my grandmother died. Because she said she never came to see her sister or them. And then she showed up immediately after she died and said, I'm going to take care of both of you. And from my uncle, I found out that, he eventually got married, and Aunt Agnes was mad at him for getting married because she said his first priority was to get a job and give money to both her and my birth mother. And I was like, no, it isn't. But anyway, he did tell me that the family was a dysfunctional family. That my grandfather, John Ambrose Pierce, was a mechanic and an alcoholic. He wasn't physically abusive, he said, but he was emotionally and psychologically abusive. And he had divorced my grandmother and married someone else. He married a woman named Frances. And I thought it was weird that my mother's name was Helen Frances Pierce. So I was like, I wonder. But I doubt that's why my mother was named Helen Frances. But anyway, I tried to make my book interesting. I talked a little bit about my studies and what was going on in my life. I discussed certain things, social issues. Basically, I bring it up as an afterthought or part of not as a crusade to say I'm for this or I'm against that, but to bring up points. And one of those is a guy going out with named Joe S., uh, saying to me, how does it feel to be going out with the only guy that you've never slept with? And I started to laugh, and I realized, what am I doing? That's insulting, because you're basically calling me a slut. And I told him I didn't think it was funny, and I didn't appreciate it. And he apologized, but that kind of ruined our relationship. We still sort of went out, but we were just friends. And I had asked him also if he had talked to Bill before he mentioned this, and he said no. And the reason I asked him that is because Bill had asked me the same thing not 5 minutes before. And it's weird because he seemed like he was saying I was sleeping with Joe. And I did tell Joe that, I just ignored Bill because he was being an ass. But when Joe said that, and I looked at him and I said, I'm a virgin. I've never slept with anybody. And at the time, I was a virgin, and I'd only gone out with 3 guys. One guy I went out with one time. Bill, I was stuck with him whenever the young adults group would go out. We always ended up being stuck together. I went out with him a couple of times, and then he introduced me to Joe. And I went out with Joe and stopped going out with Bill because Bill was getting weird, and plus he insulted me for being adopted. But I got him good because I asked him what he thought about that when I got married, I might want to adopt kids. And he told me the woman should take care of her own mistake. And I told him, I looked at him and said, I'm adopted. He didn't say anything after that. He didn't expound, or it was like he was embarrassed. And he should be, because sometimes people can't take care of their own kids. There are couples that have given up kids because either they have too many and they can't afford more, or young teenagers who aren't equipped to be a mother. And I didn't think of it at the time, but what about the father? Doesn't he bear responsibility too? Why doesn't he raise the kid then? It's just as much his kid as hers. But I digressed. But Bob and I We mixed up a couple of times, and yes, we would argue. My brother was very intelligent, but a troubled person. I think part of it was he was, in a lot of ways, he was still a kid, nursing grievances from when he was younger. He tended to keep people away from him by being as obnoxious and nasty as he could be, but he wasn't really like that. He was a paper tiger. He got his feelings hurt easily, and so he didn't want people to pity him or to get close to people because it seemed every time he got close to someone, they left. And he didn't want that. But, if you're interested in my book, please buy it. The Kindle version is $2.99, and the pictures in that are both black and white and color. The same with the paperback, which is $15.50, and the pictures are color and black and white. And like I said, I think my life is interesting. Uh, Please buy my books, whichever you can afford. I have don't bought all three of my books, which is A New Beginning, the story of my life, A New Beginning, the story of my adoption, life, and service, and Reminiscences and Beliefs, which is a poetry book, and Breck, which is a children's book for children 4 and under, if parents are looking for a cute book to read to their child. I would appreciate it. They're all on Amazon. I self-edited through KDP. I don't make much money off of any of the books. I tried to keep them cheap as possible for everyone. But I thought bought those three books and donated them to my Autauga Prattville Library here in Prattville, Alabama. And I'm still waiting for them to accept the books. But if anybody can't afford to buy a book, go to the library and ask them for it. If people go there and ask them for it, eventually they'll have to approve the books if enough people do it. And I'm going to sign off now. And thank you for listening to me. And have a great day.